The speakers are Mr. Najmuddin Shaikh, Maleeha Lodhi, Victoria Schofield, Mehdi Masud, Husain Haroon, Riaz Muhammad Khan, Philip Barton, and the moderator is Mr. Omayr Aziz Saiyid. The duration for the session is 60 minutes, with the last 10 minutes being reserved for questions and answers.
Hello, sound.
Hello. Can you hear me? It's all good? Okay, my name is Omayr Sayyid. Welcome to the discussion on Afghanistan after 2014, the consequences for Pakistan. We have a very esteemed panel of guests. I'll briefly introduce everybody. We have Mr. Husain Haroon with us. He's a former ambassador to the United Nations from 2008 to 2012. And he has also been election coordinator for the Muslim League in his earlier days. And he was served as delegate to the United Nations General Assembly and has been in various other capacities as a philanthropist and a director of different organizations. So welcome, Mr. Husain Haroon. We have with us Dr. Maleeha Lodhi, who's been special advisor to the Pakistan's largest media organization, Jung and Geo Group. Other than having served ambassador in various countries, basically twice to the United States and also High Commissioner to Britain. She has also served as a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Affairs. We have with us Ambassador Mehdi Masud, who has served as a career diplomat with the Pakistan Foreign Service. His ambassadorial assignments have included Germany, European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Kuwait, and also Jordan. He was appointed ambassador to Iraq soon after the revolution, but was unable to take the post due to the disruption caused by the Iran-Iraq war. He has written several articles, mostly in Dawn, and is a frequent participant in television as a commentator. Of course, Mr. Najmuddin Shaikh is also from our Pakistan's Foreign Service. He has held ambassadorial appointments to Canada, Germany, as well as USA, and at the end of his term served as the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan from 1994 to 97. And Mr. Riaz Muhammad Khan was also Pakistan's Foreign Secretary from 2005 to 2008. And prior to that has been ambassador to China, European Union, Belgium, and various other ambassadorial and diplomatic appointments. And finally, we have Victoria Schofield with us. Welcome again to the Literature Fair and to Pakistan. She is a writer and a commentator who has extensively written on South Asia. She is an acknowledged expert on Kashmir and is the author of Kashmir in the Crossfire and Kashmir in Conflict. Her other publications include Afghan Frontier, At the Crossroads, Wavell, Soldiers and Statesmen, Old Roads, New Highways, 50 Years of Pakistan, and Bhutto, Trial and Execution. Her most recent publications are The Highland Furies, The Black Watch, and Witness to History, The Life of John Wheeler Bennett. She's a frequent commentator on BBC and other outlets. So welcome. This is quite a large panel. So what we will do is we will go straight to and we have, of course, unannounced, unscheduled visitor, Mr. Philip Barton. He is currently British High Commissioner to Pakistan, and he will also we'll join his comments. So what we'll do is we'll skip the traditional format of individual statements from everybody because we have a large panel and go straight to a group discussion on the subject. So basically 2014 has arrived, the day the United States has promised and planned to withdraw all or most of its forces from Afghanistan. It's been a very massive effort by the entire international community, probably unprecedented in its scope, where the group of international forces have come into a country, overthrown a government, and proceeded on a project to entirely rebuild from scratch a country, rebuild its state institutions, its police, its military, civil service. And the results have been mixed. Some say it's substantial progress has been made given how difficult the task was. Some say it's very dangerous, moving forward. So now that the U.S. occupation is coming to an end, we the future is going to unfold now, whether it's going to be as successful or it's going to revert back to some, something similar to what existed prior to the foreign intervention. And the biggest issue, of course, is that the presidential election in Afghanistan is happening in April, and the United States does not have any agreement as yet on maintaining military presence in Afghanistan after 1914. So currently the so-called bilateral security agreement is under discussion. It hasn't been finalized. It has not been signed. And the current president said that the next president after the election will decide on that matter. So that leaves the ball kind of up in the air. We really don't know what's going to happen. So I think the first question I'll pose to the panel is what is really the status of the bilateral security agreement? Will it get signed? And if it does, what will be the future presence? What will be the shape of things to come? And if it does not happen, what are the consequences we're looking at? Start with Mr. Mehdi Masud, please.
Well, yes. If the bilateral security agreement gets signed, then of course there will be, if the bilateral security agreement gets signed, as many of us hope, the negative fallout will be that there will be a continuation of the present insurgency. But the positive aspects will be that it is likely to avoid a wider civil war, such as that which had erupted in the 90s. It would avoid an expansion of the Taliban power, and it would keep open the prospects for promotion of some sort of an understanding between the Afghan Taliban and the Kabul authorities. So these are amongst the positive. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, the negative aspect is that the continued retention of American military presence in proximity to Pakistan keeps open the recurring reports about the nuclear monitoring over Pakistan, which have surfaced again and again. I will not go into details because there are so many other people who would wish to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Maleeha, did you have your comment?
Thank you, Omayr. I want to first thank the audience because I feared with so many panelists, we might outnumber the audience. But I'm so happy that all of you are here. Thank you for being here. It's less embarrassing for us, all 7 of us. But with that, let me say, I think this session is supposed to look at the consequences for Pakistan of what might happen in Afghanistan. And I think the most appropriate place to start with would be with our national poet, Allama Iqbal, who once called Afghanistan the heart of Asia. And he said in a Persian couplet, which I cannot say in Persian, but a rough English translation would be, conflict in Afghanistan means turmoil for the entire neighborhood, and peace in Afghanistan would mean prosperity for all of Asia. And I think if you look at Pakistan's experience for over 3 decades, the prescience of Iqbal's comment or words, I think just so ring true. Because what we are confronted with is a very uncertain situation. Omayr, it's uncertain not just because of the BSA. It is uncertain because the 4 transitions that Afghanistan is supposed to go through, this is a year of transitions for Afghanistan. We had our year of transitions last year, and we successfully negotiated each one of them. But for Afghanistan, there is a political transition, there is a security transition, which the BSA tries to address. There is an economic transition, and most critically, there's also a regional transition. In other words, a regional consensus on what should be the role of regional and neighboring powers post-2014. And where we are right now is that there's uncertainty on every count. One, because the BSA has not been signed, whether it's good or bad for Afghanistan. I think it's a sovereign decision for the people of Afghanistan to make, which is going through an election. But for me, the most critical foundation on which all these transitions are supposed to rest and the future of Afghanistan is supposed to rest is a peace process. There is an absence of a peace process right now because the United States gave primacy to the security agreement, and I think it ended up with the worst of both worlds. It ended up with no peace process, and it ended up with no BSA. And as a consequence, I think neighboring states, including Pakistan, confront huge challenges. And we must, I think, prepare for the worst while assisting what could be a hopeful scenario in Afghanistan. But clearly there are limits to what Pakistan can do, and therefore, as a good neighbor, it can only sort of assist when it's asked to assist, whether it's in the peace process or it's in reinforcing border monitoring and border arrangements. So I'll end there. I think the challenges are enormous and the uncertainty is great.
Thank you, Maleeha. Yes, the peace process is one of the big, things we're looking at. Will there be a reconciliation or will there not be a reconciliation? And will there be continued U.S. presence or will there not be? So I think these creates four, difficult but challenging scenarios that we need to look at and discuss. Yes, Victoria?
Well, firstly, of course, I'd like to say I'm delighted to be back in Karachi at the Literature Festival. I think what we really will have for the next few months, obviously until the outcome of the Afghan elections is clear, is who is going to be the power broker in Afghanistan, who's going to be the kingmaker. If it's going to be still Hamid Karzai behind the scenes, I think I reiterate what Maleeha has said, that there are going to be huge challenges because, as we know, the relationship with Pakistan has been very fractious, and it's really up to, I think, the Afghan leadership as well as the Pakistan leadership, how they go about creating this consensus, because you're not going to make any progress on one side of the border only. There has to be progress coming from both sides of the border.
Yes, thank you. Haroon, would you like to give us your views?
Yes, thank you. I concur with Maleeha and Victoria. We're in a difficult period. History in Afghanistan for the last 200 years has clearly indicated that the Afghans do not, I repeat, take their commitments to be permanent. Normally, you will find at very short moments they change their minds, or the factions within Afghanistan have a greater say in matters sooner rather than later, and they do not honor their commitments. So we have that problem. With that, for me, there's no ifs and buts. I think the vacuums that exist in Pakistan within our own societies and those in Afghanistan, there's an arc of disenchantment from the Nile to the Indus. And I believe all these areas, in one way or another, are intertwined historically or even socially and with religious bent, of course. And in this situation, we really do not see anything good being arrived at. I think the fact that today within Pakistan, we are negotiating or attempting to negotiate with those who challenge the very being of Pakistan, those who challenge the constitution and the entire arrangement, which is our social contract. It is all being torn to shreds at every stage. And we do not have the wherewithal or the institutionalization to cover these aspects. So what do we expect from Afghanistan? And then, of course, there are no forces that exist outside a void. They come into a void. And there is a void in Afghanistan. The movement of the troops out will invite many countries to bring in their own thinking or their own cavalier instincts. And really speaking, I do not see anything of consequence that will lead towards peace or understanding between the two countries or individually inside their own geopolitical boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haroon. Ambassador Barton.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No. After.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join the panel. And if you'll allow me, I'll give you a British perspective, but with a degree of humility, because this is my fourth week as the new British High Commissioner in Islamabad, and there's a lot more diplomatic expertise on the panel than I can hope to have in all of my career. I was lucky enough in a previous job to be working at the centre of the British government on Afghanistan issues in the period from 2009 onwards. And there's just a couple of points I'd like to make in response to things others have said, which I think are important to bear in mind, although I would agree very much with Maleeha that this is a big year for 2014, and to others who said it's a challenging one, and there are certainly uncertainties and risks for Pakistan. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that, we've had an international coalition, not just the US, in Afghanistan, for well over 10 years, but it's been there at the invitation of the Afghan government and with the blessing of the United Nations. Secondly, and this is when I was working on Intensely in London, in the period 2009-10, at a time when the US in particular, but also others, were putting more troops into Afghanistan, there was also a recognition that this could not be a permanent thing. You could not have very, very high levels of Western forces in the country indefinitely. And so in 2010, a plan was drawn up basically to transition from US and other international forces primarily providing security within Afghanistan to Afghan forces providing that security. And we're coming towards the end of that process. We have been working over the last few years to build up Afghan forces. They now number 350,000. And we've already withdrawn quite significant numbers of Western forces. So in the case of the United Kingdom, pretty much half of our forces from their peak have already left. So yes, we're coming to the end of that transition process this year. And yes, there are risks. But this has been a 3 or 4 year process where I think we have had at least some success in building up Afghan forces to, if you like, take over from the Western ones with responsibility for security in the country. And they now already have the lead in providing that security throughout Afghanistan. So I think there's less of a break point than one might think. Secondly, people have rightly flagged the uncertainty over the bilateral security agreement. And yes, there is uncertainty. But again, there is an agreement. It is final. It's been agreed by both sides, as it were. Secondly, the lawyer Jirga, which President Karzai asked to have a look at it in the autumn of last year, very, very clearly and nearly unanimously said that he thought it was in Afghanistan's interests to sign that agreement. And thirdly, the majority, if not all, of the candidates in the presidential elections have also supported it. And finally, I want to just emphasise that so we in NATO, together with the US and others, we are planning very much on the agreement being signed and us therefore moving on from the role we've had over the last few years much more to a supporting role in much smaller numbers, but still able to backstop, if you like, the Afghan forces. And in the case of the United Kingdom, we've been working hard to establish an officer training school so that 1,500 officers a year will have British-style military training to provide the officer corps for the new Afghan forces. So I think there are risks, but I think there is a plan in place which has been there for a while now. And I think one can be cautiously optimistic that actually we have put some security there, so there's not a vacuum after the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Riaz, can we have your views?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you very much. Can you hear now? Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. This has been it is very clear that there is no neat end to the Afghan conflict. Is it okay? No? It's very clear that there is no Well, thank you very much for lending me also this mic. There is going to be no neat end to the Afghan conflict, regardless of whether there is a bilateral agreement leading to the residual presence of US forces, NATO forces, or there is zero option. It's also emerging that Karzai is not likely to sign the agreement. He does not want to leave and then be known as Shah Shuja of the Americans. So most probably the agreement, if it is signed, and probably it would be signed, will be signed by the next president. Zero option had one advantage, and that advantage was that if the forces leave, then it also knocks out the justification of the Taliban and other similar forces to continue their violence and their struggle because they justify it as against foreign forces. Nevertheless, the presence, as one sees, has the advantage that it will be an assurance of some kind against a collapse and widespread civil war in Afghanistan. Although the possibility of that kind of widespread civil war is also very slim, because Afghanistan is virtually fragmented. It is being controlled by strong personalities in various regions. So, what next? The Afghanistan situation remains fragmented. Hopefully the peace process will move forward, but peace process is extremely complex. We, with our own Taliban, are finding out how complex it is, and the Afghan situation is no less complex. On the other hand, I also believe that there is no possibility of the Afghan Taliban taking over Kabul, because the times have changed and they cannot launch the kind of operations which they could in mid-90s. So that can be discounted. One can also hope that the rivalries in the area will remain contained, because if there are rivalries, playing favorites, whoever does it, even if Pakistan does it, that means only continuation of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sheikh Saab, I think.
Thank you.
I would also like to add that panelists are welcome to respond to any other panelist questions. You don't have to go turn by turn. But just now we'll ask Sheikh Saab for your comments.
Well, I thought I'd try and focus on the consequences for Pakistan and make certain assumptions about what is going to happen in Afghanistan with regard to the 4 processes that have been identified. I think the 2 that are most important from Pakistan's point of view is the peace process going to go forward, and B, is the bilateral security agreement going to be signed or not? And if so, what are the numbers that are going to be involved, and what sort of international assistance will the bilateral security bring in its wake? First thing, I think, unfortunately, the developments over the last few days seem to suggest that if there was a nascent process of reconciliation that Karzai was trying to pursue, it seems to have come to naught. He has not vested very much confidence in the High Peace Council that he himself created, and at the moment they say we know nothing of the contacts that President Karzai established, and it seems that whatever the prospects, those seem to have gone down the drain for the moment at least. So we have to assume that at least until the end of this year, perhaps there will be no reconciliation. Perhaps even the start of reconciliation will have to wait upon the last few months of the year, because in my view, the presidential election is not going to produce a winner in the first round. And if it does not produce a winner in the first round, in April the election will be held and there will be a runoff election. And when there is a runoff election, then I think a new president will be in place only around July or August. This is the presumption that we should make. Second, that when we talk about the bilateral security agreement being signed, we are talking about 10 to 15,000, 10,000 American, which is the number that has been apparently been suggested to President Obama, and 5,000 NATO soldiers, put together a force of about 15,000. But they will have to contend with the fact that today there are 55,000, so it will be reduced by 40,000. 40,000 reduction will mean a great deal of reduction in economic activity. Already, economic activity has slowed down. It has slowed down because of economic uncertainties, but also because the occupation, the presence of foreign forces was generating a great deal of economic activity, which is now dying. The NGOs are now pulling out. So there is going to be, in my view, the figures from Afghanistan are that there is 25% unemployment, 36% living under the poverty line. But in my view, these figures are going to double at a minimum. And the high-paid jobs that were available with the NGOs and as people working on foreign bases, etc., those are going to disappear. And unfortunately, the Afghans will look to ways of getting out of Afghanistan to a better economic climate. There is a joke that prices in Kabul fall, prices in Hayatabad, Peshawar go up. That apparently is happening now. In Jalalabad, a price of 100 meters of land has gone from $6,000 to $3,000. So if that sort of thing is happening there, then there is a prospect of a greater exodus. I've been called a pessimist for thinking that in the best of circumstances, we may be faced with an influx of another 2 million refugees, merely because the economic situation in Afghanistan will deteriorate to that point. If there is no BSA, then of course the deterioration is going to be much greater. The Americans are now, or NATO and America have pledged $4 billion for $4.1 billion, of which 500 million are to come from the Afghans themselves, for the maintenance of the Afghan National Security Forces. But that's enough for 230,000 forces. They have 350,000. So either 120,000 are going to be dismissed and are going to be on the streets with only one skill, how to wield a gun. Or the Americans are going to put in another $2 billion a year, and that at this time seems increasingly improbable. The Americans have reduced, the American Congress has reduced the aid for 2014 from $2.1 billion, which was requested, to $1 billion. And of course, the pledge that was made in Tokyo for assisting Afghanistan for a 4-year period with $4 billion a year was, I think, premised on the fact that half of that $4 billion every year would be provided by the Americans, and the other donors would match the American contribution. In this particular case, it seems to me that if the American contribution goes down to $1 billion, so will the contribution from the other donors. So what I'm trying to say is that the situation is going to be extremely difficult, not only within Afghanistan, but as a consequence within Pakistan. I have not yet spoken about the consequences of the difficulties in Afghanistan with regard to our own situation and our own struggle against internal security problems that we are having.
Can I just...
I'll stop there because you have...
Excuse me,
Dr.
I'd
Lodhi.
just like to... May I just make a...
Okay.
I'm not going into, at the moment, discussing further the 4 options, whether it will 0 option, BSA, or peace and reconciliation. Obviously, in this limited time, nobody can discuss that in the way it should. But I'd like to just make 2 points, and one is a question. I'm really puzzled by the completely contrary accounts of the present Taliban military position inside Afghanistan by, on the one hand, the latest American National Intelligence estimates and the London-based International Institute of Strategic Studies, all being published within a few days of each other, all giving totally diametrically opposite, and that has implications for the political conclusions to be drawn. The National Intelligence estimates of the US say that by 2017, the Taliban will have such an upper hand, the authorities in Kabul will become completely irrelevant. And point out that in 2010, after Obama's surge, although the Taliban paid a high price in the south, but they continued to be operational and expanded in the east. And while the British International Institute of Strategic Studies says that the Taliban are living in a dream world, their brigadier, who was the spokesman, he gave a very detailed press conference and said by 2015 the Taliban will make no operational progress. Politically, they will be in a difficult position, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I would be very grateful if somebody would perhaps go further into. The other thing is that although we are not in a position to reach a conclusion about the 4 policy options. But there is one thing of great importance to us in Pakistan. The pressure on our borders, which is likely to come irrespective of BSA or zero option or a peace and reconciliation. As it is, about 100,000 Afghans cross the border every day. 3 million refugees are still in Pakistan, half of them are unregistered. If there are chaotic conditions further in Afghanistan, more refugees will come. And not only that, as somebody said the other day, that unless we further strengthen our border arrangements and border management and assert ourselves more in our own Pakistan's tribal areas, then God forbid, one day the Afghan Taliban may use our tribal areas for their strategic depth and just reverse the whole situation. So
if they're not already doing that.
So I think it's very important that these are some of the issues also which we know. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Omayr, can I just make a very quick point as a journalist and a writer who operates from the lower levels? I think one of the problems we all face is that nobody really knows what is going on with the Afghan Taliban. We barely know who the interlocutors are. We barely know who the company commanders are. And we've got to cast our minds back to 1996 and that period of the Taliban takeover of Kabul, where it took everybody by surprise. And I sort of tend to feel that what we ought to be doing is really getting much more aware of what the Taliban's objectives are. If it requires infiltrating, if it requires getting informers, and in this 13 to 14 year period, we don't really seem to know any more about the Taliban than we did in 2001.
May I just respond to, or take a point? May I take a point forward that Riaz made and others also reinforced, which is the uncertainty about the future of Afghanistan. I think if there's one thing that most people are agreeing on, including the Afghans themselves, it is that the likelihood, in the absence of any political settlement or political accommodation or reconciliation, as they call it, in Afghanistan, the danger is that Kabul may hold, government forces may hold Kabul, but the countryside, particularly the south and east of Afghanistan, may fall into the Taliban's hands. Now, I think for Pakistan, there are grave dangers in that. And here I'd like to very quickly flag 2 or 3 things that Pakistan's policy is about at the moment. One, Pakistan opposes the violent takeover of power by the Taliban. Pakistan doesn't want to see 1989, where the Western forces immediately disengaged and left Afghanistan to its fate and the consequences we know, because we faced those consequences ourselves. But Pakistan also doesn't want to see 1996. It doesn't want to see 2015 become another 1996. In other words, the violent takeover of power by the Taliban, which is why I think Pakistan has rightly been pushing for the revival of the peace process in Doha. I think, Victoria, if you knew the people who are sitting in Doha from the Taliban side, you'd be able to identify who they are. We know exactly who the interlocutors are from the Taliban side. They're very clear because they did arrive in Doha, thanks to an initiative that both America and Pakistan took together. But then the Americans backed off and decided that they couldn't risk annoying Karzai for the sake of the BSA. And as I said initially, in the process, they lost both. They don't have a BSA and they don't have a peace process. And I think for us in the region, the tyranny of geography is such that we cannot wish Afghanistan away. We cannot wish away the consequences that will be before us. So I think for our country, we can't sit around crystal ball gazing, because we have to prepare for the worst while hoping that the best case scenario materializes, which is a scenario where everything is hunky-dory. But I doubt very much where that hunky-dory scenario is going to materialize. So I think the great challenge for our leadership, as well as for the opposition, as well as for our policy community, is to think through what could possibly be the best way that we can reinforce our internal line of defense, fortify the border. It's not easy. But these are the sorts of things that we should be thinking about rather than scenario building, because frankly, we know that what is going to follow in the absence of a peace settlement is more turmoil. Now, whether it's of a low-intensity kind or a full-fledged civil war, either way, continued fighting in Afghanistan is bad news for Pakistan.
Thank you.
On the note of what is bad for Pakistan, I think we should take note of the fact that statements out of Kabul today are as vitriolic towards Pakistan as is possible. The National Security Advisor says that if the United States wants a national secure strategic partnership with Afghanistan, then it cannot have one with Pakistan. And that Pakistan is the main impediment to the peace process. And as I tried explaining earlier, the peace process has come to a halt primarily because Karzai has been handling it badly, has not been trusting his own people, has not allowed those initiatives that his own people, his High Peace Council had taken to move forward. And as Ambassador Lodhi just pointed out, has not allowed the movement forward of what had been a very promising initiative in Doha. Now, apart from that, I think we must recognize that in Nuristan, now there is asylum being provided to people who are TTP from Pakistan. And that one of the areas in which we now have another acrimony between Afghanistan and Pakistan is that they accuse us of shelling Afghan villages in Nuristan, ostensibly against the TTP rebels who are there, but which Afghanistan regards as a violation of its sovereignty. So I think we should also be clear that at this moment, the regime in Afghanistan is not just not favorably disposed towards Pakistan, but regards it with extreme suspicion and is almost paranoid about Pakistan.
Yeah.
I think they've made moves criticizing the Durand line recently.
The shenanigans of the Kabul regime are understandable because the kind of pressures that they are facing. Perhaps they have to sometimes criticize Pakistan, and even they criticize United States off and on. So that is not new. First thing is that 1996, when the Taliban captured Kabul, that is not likely to be repeated in 2015, 2016, whatever. Because that capture was as a result of the fact that after the Soviets left, Afghanistan was completely isolated. It was ignored by the rest of the international community, which will not be the case now because international community, including United States, knows that it can become the hub of terrorism once again. So there will be focus because it is not for the sake of Afghanistan, but because of their concerns on counter-terrorism, on terrorism itself and their experience of the past, that they will keep focus on Afghanistan. Now, in mid-1990s, if you look at the Taliban campaigns, they used to move with anything between 5,000 to 10,000, laying siege of the cities. That kind of situation, getting it reenacted again in 2015 or 2016 is not possible. But Taliban certainly are part of the political landscape of Afghanistan. Their influence will have to be accommodated through some kind of peace process. And that ought to be the thrust of the peace process. And their influence, as we all know, is southern Afghanistan and southeastern Afghanistan. What should be Pakistan's role? Pakistan must avoid becoming custodians of the Taliban or becoming a spokesperson for the Taliban. In fact, sometimes one is a bit concerned when you see the kind of news that Pakistan has said that they would release such and such Taliban leader, Afghan Taliban leader, so that there can be talks between the Afghan High Peace Council and that leader. Why should we take that kind of position? We should let these Afghan Taliban leaders who happen to be in Pakistan, and one can understand why these people are in Pakistan, because there is the demographic overlap, there is the cultural overlap, there is the history. Therefore, these people are here and we cannot treat them the way we treated Al-Qaeda. There was always a distinction that was maintained by Pakistan between Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban leadership. But now we should say these are Afghans. Afghans can meet whosoever wants to meet these Taliban leaders. They should be free to meet them. again I'll repeat that we should not play favorites, because playing favorite means continuation of the conflict, and we should understand with this 30 years of experience that conflict hurts Pakistan more than any other country in the world except Afghanistan itself.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Mr. Haroon, would you like to add?
Well, hearing all the distinguished speakers, one gets a very clear impression that there is a lot of hope. There are a lot of structures that have been put into the dialogue and in various other affirmative actions. There is also a question of trying to understand history, current and what has passed. I reiterate, the Afghan conundrum cannot be explained away on this distinguished dais, because every way they have reneged and reneged. Read what Peter Galbraith had to say with Kai Eddy, later covering up what Peter in fact said about the last elections and the power structuring in Afghanistan. It is so convoluted that to expect anything from it, I think, would be keeping a blind eye towards the obvious. Similarly, the problem we have in Pakistan, our current situation itself, already there is severe types of contentions within Pakistan where we're again looking back towards the 47 separation, whether we are federating states that should have less control from a center and more affirmative action in the provinces, or whether the provinces cede more power to a center. Everyone seems to be, and I reiterate what I said yesterday, the 18th Amendment, neither fish nor fowl. Net result is, we are not in a position currently, if we realize it ourselves, to dictate the outcome of Afghanistan or what we're going to have within Pakistan. And at the same time, we have an adversary. We may call it Pakistan Taliban, we may have it Afghan Taliban, we may call it Al-Qaeda, or so many hundreds of names that keep cropping up. What seems to be constant is they do not recognize either the Constitution and the government of Afghanistan or the Constitution and the government of Pakistan. Under those situations, they are not going to agree with anything you say. So what is the consequence? A power void, as I said earlier, I reiterated, forces will flow in. There will be disparate forces with disparate requirements and their own interests. And it's not going to stop, whether they come from the east or the west. And the whole region remains in turmoil for many other reasons which cannot be dilated upon here. There's no time, but let me say, the consequences for Pakistan, and we don't seem to be able to have either the capability or the efficiency or the sort of requirement we need to be able to take it head on. Net result of that is the consequences: conflict, war, and more war. Nobody likes saying this, but if you look at it, take a look at the current economic expansion itself within the province of Sindh, where, we can't even seem to hold a census anymore, as to what really are the true power blocks now in this province. When that emerges, there's going to be a lot of heart beating and heart rending on as to what's happening. And as said, that 3 million are known to be in Pakistan, maybe 1 million, 1.5 million more coming on the way. The spillways of the Khyber, and I call them spillways, throughout the history of India, especially the post-Muslim period, those spillways produce millions and millions of people that come into what is the subcontinent. They're not going to go away. They have their own agendas, and they are working at it pretty adroitly. We're the ones sleeping with our majority fixation. Oh, everything's all right. We're in control. We're not. There's more conflict on the way. It'll reflect itself in its own way, and we really haven't proven ourselves equal to the task. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your comments. I think one of the themes emerging is that yes, the conflict is going to continue. There's going to be a lot of problems, but the actual takeover by the Taliban of the Afghan state, as happened in the 90s, looks like it's unlikely. And one of the things mentioned is that aid is going to continue to the Kabul government, unlike happened in the 90s. So I just wanted to get some feedback on this. What do you think, Mr. High Commissioner, as Mr. Najmuddin Shaikh discussed, that the aid levels are not going to be what are committed and what are going to be planned? And secondly, as you mentioned, that the Afghan National Army has been built up to 350,000. They've resisted a lot of very big attacks by the Taliban. But, that's an army with less than 10% Pashtun representation. So is that something that we are looking at? Is that going to affect future consolidation of the state?
Sorry, just a quick input there. The Tokyo conference and the German conference and what they promised the aid and what came across, I'm sure the High Commissioner will let you know more about that. Aid has never come into the quantums promised, not even remotely clear.
I think on the point about the economic effect of the withdrawal of Western forces and other NGOs, clearly there is going to be an economic effect from that. What I would say is that since the intervention started, the Afghan economy has grown 10 times, but it's clearly going to need international development assistance and support for a long time to come. And I think there are challenges, and I would agree there are challenges around the current size of the Afghan forces and how that is paid for going forward. And what one would hope to see is that a political process would take off and move forward, which would reduce the level of violence and therefore reduce the requirement for large forces and bring them down to a more affordable level for the Afghan state and the Afghan economy. But as Ambassador Lodhi has said, less progress has been made on the political side than might have been hoped for, and so that is a risk going forward. I'm absolutely sure of that, but it's something I think that we're all cognizant of, and we will be looking to do what we can to make sure that any gap is filled over the years ahead.
I just want to make one quick point before somebody else comes in. The point I was making was not that the Taliban are poised to take over Kabul. The point I was making was that there is the prospect of more turmoil if the fighting continues and is not ended before the final drawdown in December 2014. So the diplomatic window that we have to try to get a peace process going is becoming narrower and narrower. So the thing is not that Kabul is going to fall, but if the Taliban continue to hold much of the southern and eastern countryside, we have continued fighting in Afghanistan whose impact and effects we will feel. And I think one of Pakistan's strategic objectives will be, down the road, to break the nexus between the Afghan Taliban and the TTP, because there is a connection that exists between the two. They provide each other mutual support and reinforcement. I am not aware of the operational linkages, if any, but certainly there is a linkage, and therefore Pakistan's hope is that some kind of a peace process begins to suck away the Afghan Taliban into Afghanistan, so that we can then deal with our issues of militancy in our country. And a reduced Western military presence, as Riaz has rightly pointed out, will mean that it will take the alibi that militants use to justify their acts of violence. And I use the word alibi advisedly. They use it as an excuse, but they do use it as a recruitment tool and as a way of mobilizing support for themselves. So I think for Pakistan, the challenges are enormous, and I would disagree with Husain Haroon. I think we have the capacity to deal with these situations because we know some of the lessons of history, because we know what we did wrong in the past. We did pursue dysfunctional policies, but we are not a static country. We are also able to look at a changing environment and see how best we can deal with that environment. So I wouldn't sell us that short. I think we have the ability, and I think the time has come for us to talk up some confidence in ourselves, because if we don't do that, nobody's going to do that for us.
Just make sure that the spinal column of our leadership is a little stiffer than it is at the moment.
Well,
frankly,
one argument that one hears about the aid, and I think it's important that the Americans say that they need this BSA in order to continue to support the Afghan army. Otherwise, the resources which are provided by United States will dry up. Now, this may be a pressure tactics, or it may have some reality, because the Congress has its own sort of ways of dealing with things. But I should also say that the Afghan army should not be in worse shape than when the Soviets left and Najibullah's army was there, and it held out. It was only after the Soviet Union broke apart that the Najibullah setup also collapsed. Yeah. No, not after. After 3 years, 89 the Soviets left until 1992. They held out. It was only after December 1991 that they started breaking up internally. Otherwise, they were able to hold on their own against the Mujahideen, who were stronger and who were being supported. So, but at the same time, we have to admit that the Taliban have influence in South and Southeast Afghanistan, and that has been the nature of things in Afghanistan. It has been a fragmented country that way. It was not centralized. So we should not be daunted by that, but the peace process, and everybody has a stake in the success of peace process, that can only be made a success now by the Afghans themselves. Thank you.
Look, I just want to add one point with regard to the economic picture. I think we should realize that currently the total revenues of the Afghan government are $2 billion. Their expenditures are close to $18 billion. When we talk about the developments in health, we talk about the developments in education, we talk about infrastructure development, all of that is being financed by assistance that will no longer be available. I think we should be very clear in our minds that the sort of largesse, the economic largesse that has poured into Afghanistan, the Americans give you a figure of 93 billion plus 13 billion is the total amount of assistance through military and through economic support funds that have been provided to Afghanistan. Those funds have not produced, unfortunately, the results that they should have. The amount of wastage has been colossal, but that wastage again just does generate economic activity. It generates some sort of revenues within Afghanistan, and those revenues will no longer be available. So let us be clear that there is going to be an economic slump irrespective of what the political position is. There will be that economic slump, and therefore, if Pakistan is to guard itself against the consequences, we must have better border management, and we must be prepared to take the actions necessary to prevent the nexus or the further development of the nexus that exists between the TTP and the Afghan Taliban.
Yeah, we need to take some questions before we wrap up. So, is there a mic over here? Any questions? Yes, gentleman in the grey suit.
Yeah, some reflection about 90s, and some of the esteemed panelists over here were in the middle of the policies that we were pursuing in Afghanistan in those days. What do you say? Have we learned anything out of that?
I was too young in the 1990s.
May I say? No.
At least I can pretend that, right?
No, but I would like to make a comment, perhaps, as Dr. Maleeha Lodhi said, perhaps at the moment it's not much use talking about it, but we must learn a lesson from history. I think one of the greatest mistakes that we made was when we went into Afghanistan in 79 just to allow General Ziaul Haq to outlive his normal tenure and stay in office for another 10 to 12 years. I mean, what happened was, just take your mind back to that time. Pakistan was a reasonably well-ordered, developing country, good image outside, and economically well-developed, peacefully ordered. Suddenly it was turned into a state with arms and drugs and narcotics and radicals and refugees and instability with a permanent foundation which continues to plague us today. Not only that, as far as the attitude of the Afghan people are concerned, I'm really amazed. Our Pakistani friends who go across the border, they come back and say, you cannot imagine what an average Afghan feels about the Pakistanis. And this is the brainwashing which has been done. It is time that we did something sustained basis on the official and non-official level to disabuse the common Afghan mind of the disinformation dished out against Pakistan in spite of the price paid for us, for our involvement in support of the Afghans. Never, there have been not many instances of a country paying a price in support of another country as we did for our involvement in the so-called Afghan jihad.
Thank you, sir. Any questions? We have time for two more gentlemen in the red shirt. Is there a mic over there?
Looks a bit rusty to me, the shares.
Sorry?
While we're waiting for the red shirt, Omar, can I just make the point to reaffirm that I think there's been so much misinformation about the situation on Afghanistan, and it plays out the point that nobody realized what they were going into in 1979. You blame General Zia for pursuing his jihad, but that was done with Western assistance. And I think the real reason was that everybody was unaware of the social revolution going on in Afghanistan and merely the quick fix to destabilize the Soviet Union at the cost of the Afghan people.
And involvement with the religious resistance had started even before 1979, Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My question to the panelists is, we keep on parroting about sovereignty and other things. Why can't we just throw out all these 3 million Afghans who have been destroying this country for the last 30 years? And why do we expect them that another 1.5 million will come here? Why can't we just fence the border and just let them be where they are?
I think Haroon Saab talked about strengthening our borders. Who was the question to? Would anybody like to respond? Okay.
One superficial answer is that you're a soft nation. You don't take hard decisions. But the more honest, more practical answer is that you can't do it. You can make attempts at it, but you can't fence the border. What you can do is improve your border controls and be resolute in doing it. I have very serious reservations about the fact that we were introducing a system of controls at the actual border posts, and the Afghans protested, so we moved back. This is not what we should have done. We should have insisted that we will have the biometric system introduced and we will control movement. Second, we must remember that we have traditional positions with regard to the movement across the border by the tribes. They are the easement rights that were granted in agreements that were reached by the Qaeda-e-Azam with the frontier tribal areas. Now, those need to be revised. We should have spent the last 10 years revising them. We have not done so. But at the moment, you have a legal position where the people of the tribal areas enjoy the right to cross without a passport, without any travel documents. When we say biometrics, we are only going to be taking their biometrics, not insisting that they have travel documents. We must get to that point. And we must get to that point quickly, because unfortunately, otherwise, keeping these 1.5 million from coming is going to be very difficult. I only hope you're right that it's 1.5 million. It probably will be higher. I'm a pessimist. I sound like a pessimist, but I think I'm a realist. Thank you.
Is there a question over here? Oh yeah, we'll just take both questions together. Yes, a lady.
Together. Hello. Mr. Moderator. Hello. Mr. Moderator, my question is to you.
Okay.
I find Maleeha Lodhi's argument very convincing. And I understand the economic perils that the Pakistan may be facing at the end of this year. So my question to you is, since I can sense the feelings of the audience, would you please take the views of the audience, it's a select panel, and see what they feel as to how should Pakistan safeguard themselves? Is it clear?
I'm not sure what you mean.
What I'm saying is, Maleeha Lodhi is saying that we should guard our borders.
Yes.
Najmuddin Shaikh is saying we should guard against the economic drawdown. What do the audience feel? If you would like to take their view, do they agree with these two?
He has one question.
Yes, next question, yeah. We can do like a quick survey after this with the hands.
Good evening. My name is Walid. I was born and raised in Balochistan, not far from the Afghan border. The Afghan problem, the clock does not start ticking from 9/11. We cannot guard our borders because we are liable for the current situation in Afghanistan. We funded, we trained these Talibans. The same Talibans was jihadis in 90s and 80s. We know that. Closing our doors and stop funding them, stop funding Afghanistan will create more chaos. And we'll reach to the similar situation which we were in the 90s. 13 years of war, thousands and thousands of people have been killed, along with the innocent Afghans and the foreign soldiers and Pakistani people. Is there no more threat to the national security of the world? The economy has gone better. Women have more rights. These are the slogans we were told before the war. 13 years of war and no progress. And we'll reach to the same situation. The only solution of this problem is negotiation. How can war bring peace?
Can we have a question, please?
My question is, how can there be a war on terrorism when war is terrorism itself? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
From I gather, my impression is that the panelists are all anti-Taliban. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we had the most friendly relation with Afghanistan when Taliban were in power. So if they come in power again, what harm will come to us?
We are already facing them.
But I think we agree, we're all anti-Taliban.
I think we have run out of time.
I would lastly just say, because of that, because the danger of a violent stalemate in Afghanistan exists, which is parts of the countryside controlled by one party and parts of the government apparatus controlled by another, I think that just urges there's a need and urgency to accelerate the peace process. Unless there is a political accommodation amongst Afghans, and I agree with Riaz, this is for the Afghans themselves to do, but if they seek help from others, as they did in 1992, they didn't do that on their own, for good or for bad. But if they seek help, then that help should be provided to them. And I think right now the United States is in a key position, as it was when it started the Doha process. It must return to Doha. It must engage with the Afghan Taliban again, as they did for almost a year and a half, and help bring some degree of peace and stability to a country that they have destroyed by 10 years of war and bombing in Afghanistan.
Thank you. I think we are out of time, but thank you very much, panelists, for your views. I think we've got a good overview, and thank you, audience, for your questions.